So welcome to our webinar. Good afternoon, good evening, good night. I hope we're not saying good morning, but we know that we have people from all over the world who are actually joining us. So my name is Beatrice Dupuy. I am co-directing Circle with my colleague Chantal Warner, who unfortunately could not be here today. So Circle is one of 16 language resource centers which is funded by the US Department of Education under Title VI. And this particular webinar is also co-sponsored by CMES, which is a national resource center here at the University of Arizona, which is also funded by Title VI by the US Department of Education. So before we get started, there are a few announcements that I would like to make, as well as reiterate some logistical points that have been made in emails that you have received. So the first one is that I wanted to make the announcement that we currently have a call for proposal for the L2DL conference, which is taking place this October, and the submission deadline is June 7th. And we also have an upcoming webinar on June 17th, so please mark your calendars. I also wanted to remind our audience that if you have any technical difficulties with the webinar, please use the chat function and we'll try to help you troubleshoot whatever you may be encountering at that time. But if you have questions regarding the webinar itself, please post your question in the Q&A, and we'll try either to respond to these questions live, and if we can't get through them all, the panelists will answer them in a Word document that will be posted or sent to you later on. So let me see. So the focus of this broadcast today, this webinar, was on LCTL and especially a focus on script, but we also noted that among the many participants that have registered for this particular webinar, only, many others are actually not working with less commonly taught languages. So in the end, what we're trying to do is to broaden the scope of the webinar so that whatever the presenters are going to be talking about today will be also applicable to your particular language teaching context. So with no further ado, I am going to let each panelist introduce themselves as they are scheduled to appear. We have three panelists today: Mahmoud Azaz, Liudmila, Klimanova, and Wenhao, Diao, but they will tell you more about themselves as their time comes up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the Center for organizing this. Thanks for the CMES for co-sponsoring it. It's a very much needed webinar in a special time for sure. My name is Mahmoud Azaz, and I am an associate professor of Arabic language, linguistics, and pedagogy in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. Also, I am an affiliated member in the PhD program in second language acquisition and teaching. That's an interdisciplinary program here that focuses mostly on applied linguistics. It's a great honor and pleasure to be a panelist or a presenter in this webinar. When Kate shared with us what you all found most challenging about suddenly moving into remote teaching in beginning language learning, I realized that although we teach in very different contexts, the challenges are more or less the same. Certainly, with the transition to online teaching in the second half of the semester, each one of us has made a good faith effort to cope with the situation and come up with a plan that meets the essential needs of our students and keep things move forward. This experience, memorable for most of us, I'm sure, has taught us new things. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about some of the basic guidelines that I found effective with my students. Also, I'm going to talk about how I addressed three specific challenges. These were unsurprisingly among the many challenges that you all listed in the registration form, particularly for Arabic. I will end my part by talking about some of the concluding remarks that I have about Arabic. When the university here announced the transition to online teaching, I just started thinking about the most effective things that our students will find useful. And then I came up with 10 basic things that I announced before the Zoom sessions started. So first, I asked the students to join the Zoom session 10 minutes before the class time. I used the 10-minute slot to just make sure that students are catching up, and also they are physically and mentally okay. I also asked my students to use their computers or laptops and not their phones, unless there is a good reason for not to. Third, I made sure that their video camera is on, but some students already refused to share this, and I respected their option. In the breakout rooms, I asked my students to stay on the task most of the time and not to be distracted by any of the surroundings. I asked them also to speak in English when my instructions are not clear. I asked them to take notes in Arabic and use screenshots of my physical whiteboard and save them on their desktop and then save them in an organized manner that go by dates. I also asked them to raise their hands if they have any questions and to make sure that I addressed it properly. Last but not least, I asked them to listen to the Zoom recordings in the University of Arizona box. This is a box that I established for all the students, in which they will find all the Zoom recordings ordered by dates. Some students who missed the class were asked to go and listen to the video recording and make sure that they know what's coming next on the next day. I also asked them to stay positive and to be in touch if they have any problems. Now I'm going to talk about 3 specific challenges that I found among the many questions that you all added in the registration form. And the second was how to teach writing and give feedback. Like most of you, one of the main challenges was how to teach writing and give feedback to students on their written assignments. Since the students need to be good at both handwriting and typing in Arabic, because Arabic has the calligraphy system, something that's very relevant to the Arabic language and culture, I simply bought a basic physical whiteboard and I positioned it well to be visible to my students in my office. I also used the whiteboard in Zoom, and as you know, this is a very user-friendly tool in the share screen function. It has the basic functions of text, format, and save. And most importantly, it's compatible with the Arabic language. An effective way to handwrite in Arabic was also to purchase the stylus pen and use it with the iPad that some of the students had. Some of them were able to already purchase the trackpad, that's a product by Mac, and get it connected to their laptops. But of course, the most accessible to students was to simply use the draw function with the mouse in the whiteboard application in Zoom. In elementary Arabic 101 and 102, one of the foundational skills is how to type. In our Arabic language program here, we address this in a number of ways. Starting by week 8 in Arabic 101, we ask our students to purchase the stickers for the Arabic keyboard and to start using them. Before that, we used the Aktub software. This is a specific software that was developed for Arabic, but for some reason, it's no longer active. After week 9, we ask our students to go ahead and turn in 7 written assignments in the blue book in their handwriting. And after that, they go and type these 7 assignments that are periodic all over the semester using typing in Arabic. Some students are asked to turn in the second or a revised version of the written assignments and also the typing to make sure that they are able to type in Arabic properly and at a good rate in terms of time. I really found the shift from Aktub to using the standard Arabic keyboard is straightforward. Some students had suffered at the beginning, but with practice, things were easy and straightforward to them. And as you see here on my screen, I have here 2 samples. The first is from the whiteboard that I use in my office, which is the physical one, and I use it the way I use it in the regular Arabic classroom. And the second are samples from what students did in 101, and then you can see here they scale up from 50 words and they go up to 150 by the end of 102. The blue book, that's the composition book that we use for the 7 written assignments that for most part are 7 everyday life topics like daily routine, family, daily schedule, describing the city where they live. And again, students are asked to turn in a revised version of the 7 written assignments. The second challenge that I found among the many comments that you left in the registration form was how to teach speaking and give feedback. Since in elementary Arabic, the 4 modalities are taught in an integrated manner, no single session was devoted to speaking. But some of the tips that I found effective over Zoom include the following. The first was to conduct frequent teacher-student dyadic interactions in every single session. These are, as you all know, always triggered by a clicker question that has a linguistic focus. That could be grammar or vocabulary. Immediate feedback and error correction techniques are employed after the dyad is over. In a 50-minute session, I mostly do 2 of these. And the purpose is to model what's coming next in the student-to-student dyadic interaction. The student-student dyadic interactions are always prompted with an English clue. And the classical example that we all know is to ask your colleague or اسألوا زملائكم. Like the previous type of dyads, immediate feedback and error correction techniques are employed after the dyad is over. These 2 types of dyads are followed by a simple task in which students use the breakout rooms option in Zoom. These tasks are always prepared beforehand, and the format is done in a handout that's easy to read and follow up. For example, at the end of a dialect today in Arabic 102, with the focus was on how to talk about the daily routine. We teach the dialects here mostly on Fridays. I developed a handout that focuses on the topic, and then I lay out the specific guidelines for the students. The students are asked to work with a classmate, go ahead and use Zoom, do the task, go and record the conversation, upload it to the D2L, and then I read it, and then post the feedback and meet with them in the office hours for more discussions. And when I do this, I meet with the 2 students at the same time. The third challenge was how to conduct and monitor exams and quizzes and give feedback. Also one of the most frequent questions that all of you listed in the registration form. In a lower division class, one of the many purposes of an exam or a quiz is to make sure that the learners internalized and know how to use a linguistic item. Therefore, the asynchronous format may not be a good idea. In my case, as we'll add with all the TAs that I worked with, all the quizzes and exams were conducted synchronously, with the students working on the exam and the cameras is on. For some access issues, few students may not be able to have the video camera on. In this case, the asynchronous format was used, and this was in very, very limited situations. I used to post the exam 5 minutes before the session started, and the students were requested to download it on their desktops and write their answers in an organized manner using handwriting. And the students were requested to download it and then post the answers. After they finish, they scan it if they have a scanner at home. If not, they basically take a photo of it and then they send or upload the photo under assignments. For grading and giving feedback, I used the basic comment function in the PDF where it allowed me to type in Arabic and provide feedback and correct the mistakes. Some of the closing remarks that I found. Reflecting on what went well and what did not well over Zoom, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. We used the structure that we have, and we made some minor adaptations accordingly. Although a balance of synchronous and asynchronous formats is needed, more focus should be given to the synchronous mode in foundational courses like 101 and 102. I'm not in support of reducing contact hours online and increasing the amount of time students work on their own and adjust the assignments accordingly. Teacher-student interaction in elementary courses is essential, and it's very important for accomplishing any intended learning outcome. There are some important tips that improved attendance and participation overall. The most important of which was to how to communicate properly with the students after each session. The asynchronous teaching via Zoom was found to be tiring, sometimes glitchy, even the asynchronous one. But I still believe that scheduling more optional individual sessions had helped my students to attain or accomplish the intended learning outcome. The basic formula that I used was to simplify, interact, personalize, and give feedback. Last, there are many specific questions that I have not been able to address in the 10 to 12 minute slot, but I look forward to addressing them in the Q&A part. Thank you very much. And now I'm giving the floor to my colleague, Professor Liudmila Klimanova, who is going to talk about the challenges in Russian. Thank you.
Hello again, and Mahmoud, thank you so much for giving us such a great start in this conversation. My name is Liudmila Klimanova. I'm an assistant professor in second language acquisition and Russian at the University of Arizona. And I'm also language program director for the Russian language program here at U of A. We have a fairly large program, and we teach regular sections, regular Russian courses, as well as hybrid courses and online courses. And I would say that I have had some experience with online teaching already, and also organizing it at the departmental level. But of course, the spring taught us a few new lessons, and I'm actually very excited to share some of the ideas with you. And I decided, because we were given only 10 minutes to talk about our experiences, our challenges, I decided not to focus on theory and research as much as give you some ideas about practical tips, activities and tools that you could use in the beginning level instruction. And I will talk a little bit about Russian, but I'm sure that some of the ideas that I will be discussing and talking about will definitely extend to other languages. So without further ado, let me switch to my next slide. Hopefully it will work. All right. So I said that I would not talk about research, but I wanted to start off just quoting a study that is fairly old, 2010, but there's some recent studies that find the same I guess the same reaction. Learners of non-Roman script languages, less commonly taught languages, are in general less willing to pursue online instruction, and there is even evidence that they're not as successful as learners of commonly taught languages, which is something that may not be as relevant given that we had to teach in the emergency mode and nobody had a choice, but something to keep in mind as we design online instruction for our learners. Keep in mind that students who choose less commonly taught languages, they already feel that they are challenging themselves enough to add the online modality on top of the whole difficulty of learning the language that they choose to learn. So something to think about as we design activities and we design instruction. So what does it mean? It means that motivation, student engagement, constant monitoring of student progress, making sure that we don't deal with attrition, are probably more critical with less commonly when we teach less commonly taught languages than when it comes to other languages. But maybe me, coming from Russian, I may be biased. But in Russian studies, of course, first year is where we try to keep students in the program, get them interested in the language, get them interested in the culture. And for us, things like motivation and engagement and fun are very, very critical. So what does this mean, and what what we can get from teaching Russian, because Russian is not an easy language, as we know. What are the things that we need to pay attention to when we design remote instruction for a language such as Russian? One, not sure if you can see. Reading a non-Roman script requires a lot of training, a lot of practice. It's something that takes a lot more time than, say, reading in Roman script languages, especially for English. I'm talking about English learners, English speakers, native English speakers. Phonetic and phonological systems are also very different. And when something as phonetics and pronunciation can be easily corrected in class, when it comes to online instruction, because there is a technological divide and you don't see a student in front of you, that creates a barrier, and also sound sometimes is not good. So these are also some of the challenges that we need to address, because it's not the same environment as face-to-face instruction. In Russian, we have something that's called digraphia, and it's more of a sociolinguistic concept, but what it comes down to is two writing systems. We have printed text and we have cursive text, and they, although these are the same alphabets, they actually look different, and we have to teach them separately. And that also entails problems with keyboarding in Cyrillic, which is pretty much access to instruction. If students cannot type in Cyrillic, then they cannot do activities and answer questions when they type, right? And the last three components here relate specifically to the complexity of the language itself. Russian is known for very complex inflectional morphology, which also is trained in class. We teach it in class, but it's more difficult to practice morphological elements in remote settings. Delay production, our students cannot speak the language right away. We usually teach them patterns first. They're not able to construct sentences themselves. It takes longer for them to produce their own sentences more consciously. And acquisition of vocabulary is also a big challenge. Why? Because again, going back to non-Roman script, cognitively, a new alphabet needs to sink in, and new vocabulary is more difficult to acquire, to learn with this new alphabet. So these are the 7 challenges that I think every instructor should consider when they plan an online or a hybrid section, because these things need to be addressed differently in an online setting than what we do in a face-to-face class. Just like my colleague, I would like to highlight, talk a little bit about 3 major problems that I learned from you, and these are the problems that we deal with in our program as well. The first problem is how do we teach basic Russian literacy skills in remotely, and this is teaching the alphabet, cursive writing, typing in Cyrillic, all those skills that we usually teach in class. They're much more challenging to acquire if it is just a remote setting. And in this regard, we have to keep in mind that beginning online learners are limited in their ability to recognize and decode new script, right, in target language. They usually don't have skills and strategies as language learners because they're just beginning to learn the language. Some of them learn the first foreign language with us, and they don't have skills and habits as online learners as well. So this all comes down to some metacognitive skills that need to be introduced in your syllabus, as well as linguistic skills. And last but not least, some learners are not very good readers in the first language, and that sort of adds that reading component. We teach them to read, and we teach them a foreign language at the same time. So how do we approach this in Russian? In Russian, of course, we need to teach reading skills, typing, and cursive skills explicitly through different activities. I've listed some of the activities. I will not have time to talk about all of them, but I'll be happy to return to this slide and maybe comment a little bit more about each of these activities. But by and large, what I want to say is that all 3 components need to be taught more explicitly and included in your course syllabi if you teach them in a remote setting, so or a hybrid or online setting. And reading skills are better acquired when they're done in a group setting, when students learn as a group. For example, you give them some tasks to read as a group, and they together try to decode a new alphabet, a word or a phrase. Reading games are great when they're done in synchronous modalities, or even in a setting where you record a tutorial and include some interactive components. For cursive writing, whiteboards were already mentioned. Zoom is great. We also connect iPad, iPhone to do cursive writing, to do demonstrations, how to write letters in cursive style. I want to bring your attention to annotation tool in Zoom. And there is also Miro. If you're not using Zoom in your instruction, you can use Miro, and this is what it looks like. This is a collaborative writing environment where you can write and you can add your students and they can write words and you can correct them all synchronously. So these are just some tools. Of course, there are many, many more, and you can probably you probably know more tools that can be added to this list, but just some ideas. The second problem that was brought up in the survey, and also something that we deal with in our program, is about keeping students motivated and engaged and on task in synchronous instruction. So when we teach online, how do we keep everyone engaged in the lesson and not do something else? Some of the ideas that I have here, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. One is practice flipped classroom, but it's in quotation marks for a reason. It's not really a flipped classroom, but rather lecturing less and interacting more with students. Cultivating interaction or creating a culture of interaction in your remote classes by having students use Zoom features like raise hands, yes/no features, chat functions, polling functions. Do warm-up activities with them before you begin your lesson. Have everyone participate in a warm-up activity. Avoid lengthy explanations during online classes, and try to intersperse your lecture segments with interactive questions, low-stakes quizzes, and polls. And work on sustaining attention by changing activities more often than you do it in a face-to-face environment. Change activities and modalities at least every 7 to 10 minutes of your remote class, and this will keep students alert, will keep students on task more effectively. Some of these tools, some of the skills, some of the tools that can be used to accomplish those goals are, of course, gaming activities. Zoom games are we can find a lot of them. If you Google Zoom games, word games are great for beginning learners. When you have the whole group play a word game, then a spotlight feature, show and tell type of activities when students, individual students show something and tell the rest of the group what they're showing. It could be either their room or their family or their pet. Projects and group activities, when we use Google Docs and Google Slides in breakout rooms and then have students present. And as an example of project activity, meme generators are great because they do not require a lot of writing, but they're still meaningful and fun to do, and they can be done in groups, and then each group can present their meme. And this is an example of a perception fact type of a meme where it's just one phrase, very short, simple phrase, but students create it together. I have also Flippity here on this slide and a Quizlet, which can be also used during synchronous instruction. And this one I want to particularly mention, calling on students in synchronous classes is a little bit awkward, or you can use create a wheel, a random name picker wheel, and use it in class and create a culture that the wheel randomly picks one student who will, for example, read or ask a question, and this would be it's always fun, and students always look at this as with anticipation. They want to know who's going to be next in responding. And the last problem that was mentioned in the survey was about asynchronous instruction. How do we prepare students? How do we provide sufficient amount of language practice asynchronously? And one big misconception that we have about asynchronous instruction, that it has to be passive. So it's reading or more interacting with material but not producing anything. So what I recommend is designing tutorials, interactive lectures going no longer than 10 minutes, but include a lot of interactivity, and also designing activities, asynchronous communicative activities and interpersonal activities. When you have, for each online module, you have 3 components representing different modalities. And the tools we use are Play, Pause It, Add the Puzzle, and H5P. There are 3 tools that are great for designing interactive tutorials. This is just two elements, two two resources that I could recommend for Russian. One is LLC Commons. It's a collection of online lessons for asynchronous classes. It was supported by Circle, designed by myself and a colleague from Michigan State University, Sharon Spasova. And of course, Между is a great resource as well. It's an online access, fully online Russian course. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this resource, but if you don't know this, here it is. And of course, there are many YouTube channels that you can use. Well, this concludes my section, and these are the key points that I wanted to make today in this 10-minute segment. I will hand it over to my colleague Wenhao, who will talk a little bit about Chinese, and we'll cover a little bit more theory and research, and then I'll be happy to answer your questions about my segment of this webinar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wenhao Diao. I just became an associate professor in the Department of East Asian Languages at the University of Arizona. Before I start, I just wanted to check, can everyone see my slide? Okay, so for my part, I am going to be focusing a lot. We've seen a lot of questions asking about interactions and motivation and anxieties. So even though we're talking about beginner students, my part is actually going to be dealing with the social affective factors, and I'm going to give some recommendations for activities both online and offline, and that some of these may actually address the questions that we're already seeing in the Q&A about, okay, in real life, in in-person classes, we do role plays. What do we do for group pair activities in online? So I hope I can address some of these questions. So anyways, the objectives of my portion is really to focus on issues such as motivation, anxiety, by giving you some sample activities and also some recommendations. So to begin with, I would like to a lot of us are here because we are anxious about teaching online, right? Teaching online leaves so many questions for us, but it is also important to point out that based on research, learning online is also anxiety inducing for our students, especially for beginner students. They have, this may be because they have a lack of familiarity with the technological resources that we're using, and also the interpersonal distance that we have online. You don't see the instructors in person, you don't get to talk to other peers, right? And oftentimes, at least based on the research published in early 2000, back then the resources were very passive, that students ended up just being passive consumers of online materials. Like Liudmila was saying, it was just presentational, it was just listening, not speaking, not interpersonal. And also we know that there's a lack of physical cues, right? Sometimes even with Zoom, sometimes it freezes, so there's a lack of facial expressions or maybe a delay of it. So what do we do then? And we also, anyways, combining those factors, we know that regular participation in online format requires more motivation. We know that students who are highly motivated do well in either format, but students who are struggling would perhaps have more struggles when they learn online. So I'm going to focus on some of the parts. Obviously, there are many things that I will not be able to cover, and the examples that I'm going to be giving would also be broadly conceived as beginners, so not first day of Chinese 101, but rather maybe from Chinese 101 all the way to perhaps Chinese 201. And we do know from research, based on these, research about students' anxieties, motivation when they do online learning, that teachers play the most important role. So this is the moment that we shine, but also the moment that we struggle the most, perhaps. And human interaction. So even though we're learning and teaching online, we want to create a culture that encourages human interaction, not interaction between, technology and humans, right? Use technology as a medium for communication among humans. And also in terms of motivating, we have to think of students as people, persons online. They are people, they are persons in the online, in the social media world, in the social, digital social world online as well, right? Rather than just the L2 learners. And I think this point perhaps is is particularly salient to teaching and learning Chinese and perhaps some other, especially some other East Asian languages, because we know that social media use is very prevalent in these parts of the world. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that as well. So the first point is really to focus on teaching and learning, but not technology. So try to, we have to, obviously for beginner learners, we might have to spend a class or two to really orient students to these specific technologies. But after that, hopefully the teaching would always be module-based and routinized. So we don't introduce new technologies every other day. And teachers also don't have to worry about not knowing all the technologies, all, out there in the world. We choose technologies and then we recycle them, right? And so, for those of you who use, for example, D2L or Blackboard, perhaps having everything in one place. So even though you're planning on use YouTube videos, maybe try to embed that video, or maybe provide a link so that this is the place that the student would always come back to. And if you prefer having your own course site, for example, a WordPress site, then having everything on there too, right? And then expectations need to be made very, very clear. So in my own online teaching, I always have a checklist for every single class, both before, during, and after, so that the students who have, they have asynchronous tasks, synchronous tasks, and asynchronous tasks afterward. So then they know what needs to be done then, or when. And also, if you expect any form of online participation, be it online presentation, online writing assignment submission, make sure that the rubrics are very, very clear. How many words? Give some bad examples. So, saying things like, I agree would be bad, but giving reasons why you agree would be good. Obviously, that's not a language class, but that's an example. And another point I think is really interesting and important is that online teaching still takes place in the physical space. We are not, I'm sitting on my couch. So this is a physical space. So I think that just because we're online doesn't mean that we all of a sudden lose all the physical space there. So for example, I've seen Chinese language teachers using Zoom to do Chinese quizzes, asking all the students to write down on a piece of paper and just show that paper to show that they've done it, and then submit the photo of that quiz results to a folder online as a quiz. So handwriting is very, very important to learning Chinese. That is one way of, doing handwriting. Obviously, there are tools to do handwriting as well, but this is the most original way. Another example of utilizing the physical space is also to think that students are home. So in addition to all the activities that Liudmila already introduced and games, there are things that we do at home that can be incorporated into language class. One example that I saw was a friend of mine, Wu Ping, who shared her example, was to show cooking online as a class activity. And we can think of ways to introduce, for example, the Chinese bar structure, right? Put something in the pot, right? And then you would have to repeatedly use that structure to explain how to make fried rice, for example. And the second point is human interaction, right? We want to use technology, not because we want people to learn technology. We want people to learn Chinese or Arabic or Russian, right? And so we want students to use technology to maximize interaction. So this, as Liudmila was saying, it's not just teacher-student, the kind of interaction, but also student-student, the kind of interpersonal communication, but also presentational as well, right? So we want to have, for example, VoiceThread. There's also linked, L-I-N-G-T, I forgot to put there, which is another way to give audio feedback. And you don't have to go all the way till the end of the slides. You can actually have the interaction after every slide. And then there are other resources that can allow interaction with peers and feedback. For example, I know a lot of Chinese instructors are using Kahoot, which is a poll, what's it called? A poll survey kind of tool. And I do want to also talk about social media. WeChat is so prevalent in China, at least. And I know that in other cultures, at least in East Asia, similar tools are very, very popular. So I have actually used WeChat in my own teaching, and that was before the COVID outbreak. I'm going to introduce that as an example to you. This would require some more work for teachers, obviously, but I think this is also one way of connecting students with these languages that are considered less commonly taught and more remote. So I do study abroad research, so I've done a lot of research about peer-to-peer interaction, peer collaboration, and I've seen this example from actually another colleague, Emma Trentman, who teaches Arabic, actually. So the example that I'm going to show you was what I used last year for my Fulbright Hays project. And the way we do it is, so this is very beginning. We just learn greetings. And so the way we do it is to basically first introduce language goals. So this is, obviously I have to spend some time to make sure that all the students know how to set up a WeChat account. And then I have, connections in China to get their peers in China to talk to these students. There is time difference, and so we had to make arrangements for that. But I think for the purpose of Chinese language teaching, we don't have to have the synchronous conversations. We can leave messages, and we can have students responding to these messages later or the next day. So, but the key here is to have these can-do statements before these assignments, these assigned telecollaboration. So, for example, these are very, very simple Chinese 101, answer simple questions about nationality, occupation, I can, So after introduce that, I asked the students to write down, to prepare the greeting expressions that they plan to say to initiate the conversation, and write down questions that they would like. So then I didn't check these. Obviously, instructors could make decisions. You can help students to prepare. And then these were intended, we had to consider the peers in China, what they wanted to do. So maybe they wanted to practice English. So then we did ask them to, write down questions that they would like to discuss with their peers in English as well. And so this was one example of peer telecollaboration. This could also be tweaked to be used for peers, L2 learning peers. So for example, more advanced Chinese language learners and lower level Chinese language learners as well, right? And we wanted to have some kind of follow up as well. So as I said, we wanted to use class time to help people to set up, but also follow up is usually, I didn't do this for this specific activity, but I think it's important to have some kind of follow up for instructors to assign some kind of, for example, submit a screenshot with expression and a part of conversation that was very interesting to them. Or one other thing that students find motivating is they find that in Chinese social media, stickers, very cute images are very popular, and these often contain expressions in Chinese as well. So that's another way of learning script. And also we could also assign conversations through audio, so students could record their voices, and then they could we could ask them to transcribe a part in writing that contains particularly interesting expressions. So this is just one example. And then moving on to the last part, the motivating the person rather than the language learner. That means that we don't focus just on form, meaning how things are being said, but also meaning what are being said, meaning that as an instructor or as their peers or as their as other students, they genuinely wanted to hear what is being said, and then delivering instructions in ways that are meaningful to students' lives. So I've seen a lot of examples of Chinese language instructors using, the new normal of in the post-COVID world to explain final particle le, right? So before I could go to stores, now I have to stay at home, le, right? And so this is a very good way to introduce that change of state. And then using the internet is also I think in some ways it's also motivating inherently because we are consumers, we are people on the internet as well. And so we could also use this opportunity to introduce authentic, meaningful materials. So, my co-panelists have already introduced using YouTube videos. So I'm gonna introduce you 2 more examples of using YouTube videos for a beginner Chinese. So the first example, I hope that all of you have heard this Thomas Afu. He's a German, and he lives in Shanghai, and he makes these video blogs, vlogs. They are accessible both on YouTube and also Chinese websites. And a lot of these are very, very mundane everyday life. So for example, this video was about how he could survive in Shanghai with only 10 yuan RMB. And so it was about him shopping in the food market, going to different places, asking how much everything was, and negotiating and getting the money. And so the video itself is 12 minutes long, pretty much all about asking for price. And it has both the Chinese expressions and also the English translation. So it's very much, very authentic. And you can design the asynchronous, the synchronous, and then the follow-up asynchronous. And again, put everything in one place. And also I think one way of thinking about teaching online is that when we have, for example, 50 minutes, we don't have to have one teacher lecturing for 50 minutes on Zoom. We could actually have a combination of asynchronous and synchronous activities. So we could ask people, we could ask students to write down the prices for the terms, and then we can actually come together to talk about how much the noodles cost, how much the other one costs. And then we can have another, group activity by using breakout rooms on Zoom. And then we can ask them to do a voice thread video afterward or something, some kind of assignment later and submit. And then we will have the class to decide which budget accomplishes the most in terms of the cost and nutrition, or obviously you can tweak that. And another example, so anyways, and I think the other way, the other benefit of using these videos by Afu is that to see someone who uses Chinese as a second language and to see how that is being treated in the Chinese, authentic Chinese context. And also he has a lot of videos of him talking to other speakers of Chinese. And so you see Chinese being used as a lingua franca rather than just among Chinese speakers. And so next, I'm going to be very brief about this example. So this example is a commercial. There are a lot of commercials. Some of them are very, very advanced, but others are actually quite simple. So this one is talking about the left behind children, the migrant workers' children who are left behind in rural China. And so the audio was very simple. They are in the mountain, we're outside of the mountain, they're outside of happiness, we're inside happiness. So this is a potential possibility to teach inside and outside in a very meaningful way. So, we can assign students to watch the video and then to have some kind of listening quiz. It doesn't matter how many times they listen, re-listen. The point is to really listen meaningfully, right? And then we can have a group work. Teachers could help students to design another commercial using the structure to talk for a social cause. And then we can have them upload their audio recordings, and we can have class voting for each other so that we have that interpersonal and presentational skills as well. And so I believe I'm running out of time. And so I'm sure that our audience have a lot of ideas and questions and comments. I do want to remind all of us to think about social justice and accessing online teaching. So when we think about, I think some of you already have commented, perhaps, my students do not have access to internet. This is something that we could discuss more during our group Q&A. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all our panelists. And we do have some questions, so I'm going to try to group them, and there may be some that we don't have time to answer today. But like I said, we will be sharing the Q&A with our panelists, and each of them can actually chime in if we don't have time to do all that. So one question that was asked at the very beginning is, how do you check in synchronous exams that students do not cheat? How do you go about that?
you like me to take this one?
Sure, why don't you go ahead, Mahmoud.
So I know it has been debatable about the space and violating the space of the students. First, I asked the students to turn the camera on. And if a student insisted, he or she, that he's not going to just turn the camera on, there is something here. Some people use Examity, which is a tool to make sure that students are not cheating. But even with only the camera, it's easy to see if the student is looking at other resources or other materials while he or she is doing the quiz or not. But what I think is most, what was most insightful was, it's easy to guess who was cheating on a quiz without even seeing that the students cheated already. So they also go ahead and use Google Translate or use other resources. It's easy to make sure to guess that the student was cheating. If I had that sense, I quickly go ahead and schedule a meeting with the student to double check that this is what they actually can produce without looking at resources. So just to answer it briefly, I just ask them to turn the camera on. I make sure that they are not reading any resources or taking any from the notes that they already took in class.
All right. I would like to follow up here, maybe just add a couple of comments. I think with this pandemic and emergency remote teaching, I think we are rethinking the idea of performance assessment as being probably more reliable and more trust building than achievement type of assessment. And by performance assessment, I mean constructing our assessment tools, not from the point of view of checking declarative knowledge, but rather having students participate in or engage in situations where they can perform in a language. And those situations cannot be checked through Google Translate, but rather if student understands how to react in a communicative situation, what to say, how to construct a sentence, that would be for us, I think, a better indicator of their performance rather than checking if they are not, checking their textbooks, not verifying their responses against a certain grammatical chart, right? So this idea of performance assessment is actually something that I really like. I think it's just more of a change in the field that we are observing right now, is rethinking assessment in general.
I also think that when we think about, obviously there are, legitimate concerns about cheating when we teach online, but at the same time, especially for beginning language students, what is our goal? If the goal is for them to learn in this process, if, for example, handwritten Chinese language quizzes, if by looking back at the textbook, they're writing that character correctly, that's a win for me. I think that they are practicing still, right? Yes, they are copying from their textbook, but isn't that practicing? In terms of using other technological machines, for example, machine translation, Google Translate is horrible. Chinese, English, any machine translation is not ideal. They can get meaning across, but I think language instructors can easily spot that and can tell them, this is why you need to learn the language rather than using machines. And I think that if we think of the goal is to get students to engage in using the target language, I'm not as concerned about cheating.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, I'm scrolling down back to, because other questions have come up as you were answering this. So would you recommend oral performance assessments rather than any other formal ways of assessing in this particular context?
Would you like me to take this one as well?
Sure.
So in my view, both of them are needed. In a foundational course like Arabic 101 and 102, we build them at the same time. We build the spoken proficiency and the written proficiency. So we need to develop them at the same time, even with the pandemic situation and the transition to online teaching. So I still believe that working on the discrete points in a language system, like the basic vocabulary, the sound system, the literacy part, these pieces have to be mastered first. The performance assessment part that Dr. Klimanova talked about is very interesting. and the use of rubrics that can guide students on how to deliver in a performance-based task should help students to know the expectations beforehand. But I still believe that there should be a combination of the written and the oral at the same time.
Great, thank you. Well, since you were talking about rubrics, somebody had a question for Wenhao. Where can I find the standard rubrics for Chinese speaking?
I'm not aware of any. So, I mean, there is actual OPI, but that's more sort of, you know, level placement rather than, you know, the sort of formative assessment, right? I think that instructors have to, you know, make your own decision based on the context, your students. For example, for Chinese language teaching, we cannot have the same kind of rubrics and requirements for Chinese 101 here and the Ivy League schools, right? And certainly we cannot have the same rubrics for you know, K-12 students and us. However, I do think that, you know, there are more holistic ways of measuring, and there are more sort of, you know, looking at the aspects of language. So for example, I gave you the example of can-do statements. I think that's a very good way of thinking of holistic assessment, you know, meaning I can do something, I can do something. We can have students to check these. We can also check them and see if they can actually function as such. And then we can also look at the specific forms, right? Not just the form, but not just meaning and form. And I am looking at Zeng Laoshi, Dr. Miaofen Zeng from University of Virginia, who just left a comment saying that there is this book called The Handbook of Tasks and Rubrics for Teaching Chinese. And so that book apparently has 50 task-specific rubrics. Again, you know, even when I teach language classes, even when I have all these rubrics, still we have to make specific changes based on the context that we're teaching in.
Would you like to just a quick follow-up on this? I have been working on a project for Arabic with a specific focus on performance assessment. So part of the project was to develop rubrics to evaluate the presentational modes of interaction and the interactive or interpersonal mode of communication for the first area, which is communication. And part of the project is to develop a number of rubrics that can help teachers evaluate student performances in the presentational and interactive mode. We basically built these around the actual guidelines with the 4 proficiency criteria that we use in the OPIs. We already adapted them, accommodated them, given the specific tasks that we have in the project. But we also added a few ones, like how to ask for a clarification while you are doing the task, how to offer some sort of repair for the other one or the other interlocutor. So we ended up by developing rubrics that have 7 criteria, 4 from the actual guidelines, and then we added 3 more.
Yeah, and also I think for learners, the OPI rubrics are actually more applicable. They actually differentiate lower levels quite well. Yeah. And so, you know, the novice low, novice mid, novice high are actually, they can actually be utilized with some tweaks. Whereas the problem is actually with advanced, then you cover a huge range, all being advanced mid. And so that's where we have the problem. So I think for beginner students, actual OPIs with some tweaks are actually quite easy to use.
I'd like to piggyback on what Wenhao just said. In our program in Russian studies, we use proficiency based assessments, and we use active OPI guidelines as benchmarks to establish function that we expect students to do after each semester. And then we evaluate each function based on whether a student is able to complete it fully or partially, or still needs work. And based on that, we can then see the progression from first semester to second semester. And I'm talking about oral assessment and written assessment production skills. We have not done this with reading and as much and listening because it's a lot of work, but this is something that we definitely could consider doing and thinking about assessments from the point of view of function that a student can perform, and going kind of with the backwards design for studying to look at what we want to get at the end, what we want students to be able to do, and then kind of structure our assessments based on the functions we want students to learn to be able to do at the end of the semester.
So one question, since we are on the topic of assessment, one question was, can you give an example of how much written feedback you give for your students on a PDF? Does the amount of feedback vary with different types of assignments?
With the case of Arabic, so we have two different types of assessments. Very specific ones, like when they do like an activity or an exercise. And the second is the longer one, something along the blue notebook that I talked about. I try to be very specific. If the student, in the sense that I just highlight it and then I add the correction, and sometimes I give some ideas of how, if they are able to correct this by themselves. With the case of the written pieces, if the piece that the student turned in is really in bad shape, I will go ahead and request to meet with him or her on an individual basis. I prefer not to give any corrections, but to just jump into the thought process and then discuss each sentence, each segment as a thought process and then provide the corrections. But if the piece seems to be good, I just provide the corrections, and the criteria that I use is if it makes to 80%, like 8 out of 10, that means it's good. If it's below 8, I request to meet with the students individually.
So I
Yeah,
see.
sorry, I also just wanted to respond to that question very quickly. I think that for beginner learners, you know, for example, Chinese 101 all the way perhaps to Chinese 201, I don't think that we have assignments that would require extensive amount of written feedback, because the written assignments are usually not that complicated. But I do think that I agree with Mohammed that if, you know, if, for example, if I've seen essays that are clearly from Google Translate, in those cases, I would actually talk to the student and explain why this is not okay in a variety of reasons, because it doesn't make sense. That's number one. But yeah, so you can also have a variety of feedback. I don't think that I don't think written feedback is the only way, even for written assignments. There's also the option of leaving audio feedback based on the channel that you're using.
Okay. So I think I see some people also posting questions in the chat, so it makes it a little challenging to go back and forth. And I'm not quite sure what this was in relation to, maybe rubrics or particular objectives. Somebody was asking, do you expect any modifications to these objectives post-COVID-19 due to online learning? Do you believe students will succeed with the same amount of material as they would in the in-person class setting?
An interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think, yes, we were expecting some big changes in the field after this pandemic. Our students are now more experienced to online teaching. All of them had some training now. They know what it is. And we also, as instructors, we learned from this experience. There is some silver lining in this emergency type of remote teaching, because I think we are now considering the idea of flexibility. The new modality now is high flex instead of hybrid. Now we're talking about high flex instruction, where we will be offering 2 modalities in one class. And some students will be attending face-to-face. Some students will be taking the same class online. This, of course, adds more work, but it's an interesting modality that goes back to what Wenhao mentioned at the end of her talk, the idea of social justice and access to learning. If we are going with the flexibility model, that includes more and more students who otherwise would not be able to take language classes or pursue a degree in such a difficult language as Chinese or Arabic or Russian and less commonly taught languages. So definitely we'll see some big changes. That's my prediction, of course, but I feel that there will be some changes in the way we approach teaching, in the way we approach online teaching and assessment as well.
Great. So I want to finish with, like, there were several questions regarding engagement and keeping students motivated, and that probably will be our last question for today. The other questions, I will be inviting the panelists to try to answer them so that we can share that with the audience. Several questions about, so one person was talking, is mentioning that for their program, they do the entire teaching asynchronously. And they'd like to ask if you have any suggestions to increase student engagement in this particular mode. Another one was asking, what are some strategies to capture the attention of distracted students? So I think here we're talking about both synchronous and asynchronous. You know, how do you keep, let's say, 25 students' attention on, you know, in what is going on online, as well as, you know, if it's all asynchronous, how do you keep them motivated and going with what you have?
I think that a lot of the activities that I've introduced could actually be done asynchronously alone. We could still have the audio input output through, you know, VoiceThread and WeChat, etc. There are issues with in a completely asynchronous teaching for these languages, I believe. For example, you know, we miss that direct immediate feedback when we have, you know, the Zoom setting or whatever form that you're using. I think, for example, you know, the handwriting and I think that, you know, sometimes I do think something is being absent if we are only doing asynchronous. However, you know, if you have to do that, it can be done. Instructors would have to use a lot more time. We have to grade a lot more audio recorded assignments. We have to provide a lot, you know, videos and audios, and utilize a lot more of the social media and online resources. It takes, simply put, I think online teaching requires much more time, even with synchronous, for teachers to prepare. And if it's only asynchronous, that's another story. A lot more time.
I think the nature of the course is an important component in this formula. With the pandemic, I was teaching two courses. One was the foundational one, 102, but I was also offering a content course in Arabic, language variation. It's a content course offered entirely in Standard Arabic. My experience in both courses was different. Perhaps the asynchronous format could work more if the instructor is more organized and structured with the higher division course. I still believe with the lower division course, a big portion of the class has to be conducted synchronously, because interaction is an important component of building the system of the language. We got one question, I think, in the registration form, how possible to just reduce the expectations and the assignments and use an asynchronous format. I'm not in support of this. When we shifted to the remote teaching, along with the TAs, we came up with the plan to stick to the rules. Let's just stick to the structure that we have, try to put all the internal learning outcomes in place. We have to make minor adaptations. I think we were like 90% successful. It was hard. It took us a lot of time, a lot of effort to keep reaching out to each student who missed the class, to just keep the attendance solid and keep the components or requirements that we put in the syllabi in place. I still believe this is very good to the success of any foundational course, Arabic 101 or Arabic 102.
Great, thank you, Mahmoud. I think we're going to have to stop here. I want to thank again our panelists for wonderful, engaging presentations. I want also to remind people in the audience to complete our survey. This is really important for us to first to know whether we're on the right track, if there's other things that you might want to, you might be interested in. It's also for us a way of telling our funders how important this particular work is. Thank you.